Kia ora, Gareth. Welcome to the Impact Collective podcast. Just wondering if you could briefly introduce yourself, who you are, where you come from, what is it that you're doing now?
Oh, well, kia ora, Steve. Thanks for the opportunity. I mean, look, I'm just a regular kid from Tairāwhiti, Gisborne, you know. Dad worked at the freezing works, mum was on the DPB for decades. You know, growing up, kid about girls and cars and rugby, and that was about it. But I got really, I think, passionate about the environment when I went to university, and I was the first in my family to go. And I learned about, you know, sort of the world and what was happening and the environmental crises, and I got really inspired by that. And since then, I've spent my entire life trying to make good change. That's been everything from working with Greenpeace and, you know, organising marches and getting arrested, dressed as Ronald McDonald as a young man. It's been everything from, you know, petitions. It's been working with animal rights organisations. You know, I've tried everything. I even got elected to Parliament and served there for a decade, where I worked on, I think I had about 14 portfolios at one stage. So, you know, that was a wonderful sort of education into our country, being able to go to people's, you know, farms or labs or sit around their kitchen tables and hear about their lives. So I've always been pushing for change. I then sort of, when I retired from Parliament, moved to a little conservation island in Otago, where I lived on Quarantine Island with my whānau. We were the only residents there, and I spent some time writing a biography of my mentor, Jeanette Fitzsimons, and working with the food rescue sector and conservation groups. And then I sort of reflected on the island. I've spent my entire adult life working for change, but a lot of it's been fighting the symptoms, you know, trying to debate what type of ambulance should be at the bottom of the cliff. I really wanted to work upstream and focus on systems, so that's why I was so rapt to be the founding country lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa Hub.
Awesome. Gareth and I first met while we were both speaking at the Aotearoa SDG Summit held at the University of Waikato recently. You're currently sitting as a chairperson for SAFE and as a country lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa. Now, all of this leads us to acknowledging that you're clearly a recovering politician, an advocate for the climate and for animals, an author of A Gentle Radical, a speaker and an innovator in terms of challenging the status quo for our economy. So kia ora.
Yeah, kia ora.
Speaking at the SDG Summit, you spoke about the Economy Alliance Aotearoa, which was something that I was truly intrigued about. Unfortunately, our speaking times kind of clashed, so I wasn't able to see you speak at the time. But the Wellbeing Alliance, what is it, and how is it going to be able to support wellbeing in general going forward?
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the most exciting and important global organisations happening right now. When I discovered the Alliance, I was over the moon because about 4 years ago, a group of leading international thinkers in the sort of progressive economic space came together. There were people like Kate Raworth from Donut Economics, who's really reshaped the profession. People like Dr. Catherine Trebek, who's going to be in New Zealand soon, talking about how we can manage the economy differently to deliver wellbeing. People like Jason Hickel, a degrowth proponent, a vibrant new field questioning this constant growth. So they came together about 4 years ago and realised that there was all this good work happening, but there was no one actually connecting all this good work and amplifying it. So the organisation has just grown and grown in leaps and bounds since then. We've now got hubs in 15 countries. I was proud to formally establish the charitable hub in New Zealand. We've got a governments network, including New Zealand, Canada, Finland, Wales. We've got a network of 88 global thought leaders, ambassadors, a huge number of academics, huge number of supporters and alliances members. So what I find so powerful about it is it's a true alliance, an umbrella organisation. We're not saying this is the one answer or this is the one political idea that we need to follow. It's this global search for designing a new economic system that we're all part of, and it's incredibly exciting to be part of a global community working towards it.
So there's a couple of things there that are really interesting to try and unpick actually. So first of all, you've mentioned that it's a global organisation. It's not just Aotearoa centric. Awesome. Part of the thought process that we had when we were establishing the Impact Collective was around aligning to global frameworks. And one of the pieces of legislation that I always found very interesting was the Future of Generations Act out of Wales. Is there a natural affiliation between the definition of what you guys are defining as wellbeing, which is obviously not just economic focused, and the likelihood of it improving the outcomes of future generations? question one. Question two, alongside that, is does that therefore lead into policy decisions and implementations here in Aotearoa?
Yes, absolutely. And there are different ways you can measure well-being. Some people prefer surveys of how people are reporting. Other people use a metric of range, or a Mata Sen looks at capabilities, your capability to lead the life that you want to live.
Yeah.
However, what we see in New Zealand is, we've had ups and downs over the years, as you can measure on the dashboards. Things like the child poverty indicators are dipping slightly, which is wonderful. But I think people sort of realise when you look around society today, there's a lot of cracks in the system, there's a lot of problems. I remember homelessness wasn't an issue growing up in New Zealand. Now it's sort of pervasive. We've got one of the highest greenhouse gas emissions per person in the world, despite this clean green brand. So when you take, I think, a broad look at well-being, there's a lot of room for improvement in New Zealand, I think, so a way to put it diplomatically. I think another area in these sort of turbulent times where a lot of ideas are debated is that I think everyone can kind of agree that we've been pretty poor at long-term thinking in New Zealand. I can see it living in Wellington with the sewerage geysers. We can see it in a whole range of measures in our society, and that's where I think the Welsh Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is such a sort of exemplar. It's interesting to look at the genesis of it, because they actually looked at our original independent officers of Parliament model, the Ombudsman, the Parliamentary Commission of the Environment, as inspiration. And they've run with it and set up this new office, someone with mana and profile and a bit of clout and influence to advocate for future generations. Everyone in Wales now, even companies trying to procure for government services, has to demonstrate how they're acting consistently with the principles. So we've got some good examples of long-term thinking like Wakatu and in the top of the south, and Nelson with the 500-year strategy. We've got other entities thinking long-term, some insight briefings at the government level, promoting a bit more long-term thinking. But this is one of those, I think, laws that I'd love to see a Member of Parliament put up as a member's bill or a government adopt, because it's kind of what we need, someone there with the mana and the profile to advocate and a regime to think long-term. I also find it a little ironic that the government requires local government to think long-term with 10-year plans, no such requirement at the central government level. And that's something I noticed in my decade in Parliament, how bad we are at long-term thinking, working with the opposition, no matter who the government is, and trying to find these consensus areas where we can agree. Pretty frustrating, I think, for voters when you see that one party comes in, builds a bunch of state houses, the other one sells it, one crunches ministries together, the other separates it. We see this, wild variation with transport infrastructure. So I think this is an area we could really do better in New Zealand. We're part of this global organisation, but as a New Zealander, I'm quite proud how the world has been looking at New Zealand these last few years. Things like the wellbeing budgets, the National Wellbeing Report, the Living Standards Framework developed within government have really inspired people globally. The way we responded to COVID, earned a lot of plaudits, the message of kindness. So it's wonderful being in a global organisation and able to sort of share New Zealand's story. And despite some of the negative things I talked about, from child poverty to climate change, we do have a lot we can be proud of and things we should share. And one of the things I love, and I think, we're a globally interconnected society, so we have to work local and we have to work globally as well. So one, I think, good example is working with my colleagues. We collaborated internationally on a best practice global policy design guide for policymakers to think broader than just economic growth, to think about well-being, future generations and a host of other measures. We then trialled it actively in Porirua and Lower Hutt with community partners, and then we shared those lessons globally. So it's the sense that we can work hyper-locally but also share it globally, which is tremendously exciting.
Ultimately, we're talking about wicked problems that you've come across. So social housing, child poverty, they're not things that are easily fixed, and they're not things that can be fixed within a political term. They do require that long-term thinking. So if we think about that approach, should there be in our parliamentary system, especially in central government, non-negotiables when it comes to long-term planning, that a course of action is a cross-party voted on, that sets a line of sight for 20, 30, 40, 50 years to tackle these wicked problems, so that they don't become political fodder, for want of a better terminology, during the election cycles, and actually gets to the crux of the cause and can start making that sustainable change.
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't something new or novel. I mean, something we've done historically. You could look at, say, the Reserve Bank Act. That framework has been solid for decades. The Zero Carbon Act was another formal response which tried to bring in an independent entity. Parliament comes together to set these 5-year carbon budgets. You can see it sort of informally with maybe superannuation policy, though that's sort of been opened up again recently. So yeah, we've got some examples, but I would love to sort of formalise it. It was something the former Speaker, Trevor Mallard, and I worked on in the last Rules Committee, the Standing Orders Committee of Parliament review. There's no incentives in the parliamentary system to encourage parties to reach out to the opposition, to craft legislation together, to really involve them in an early stage in legislative design. One of the little changes I did manage to get through after pushing for many years was the private members bill ballot, which is this cute little part of New Zealand's parliamentary democracy that, groundbreaking legislation from marriage equality to others has been pulled out of a biscuit tin from Decca. Yet it's entirely down to the luck of the draw if that legislation gets pulled. Now there's a mechanism that if you can get a majority of non-executive members of Parliament to support it, it can proceed through the parliamentary process. So we've got some basic starts for it, but I think this is what people want to see from our politicians, is working together, planning better, not sort of having these wild sort of policy shifts. And, just reflecting, having spent some time on WEAII, how different the tenor of debate is when you're sitting on the floor around the walls of a building. There's no timer, there's no bell, there's no vote after a certain amount of time, and if you get 51% you win. Whereas in Parliament, you sit at the little desks, exactly the same dimensions as Westminster, and it's such a different tenor of debate. I think the public would love to see us maybe take some of those more consensual, consensus-based, taking time to reach better decisions rather than just getting a bad decision across the line.
I think that's actually reflective of what we're hearing at a community level. When we initially started engaging with the community around their experience in the post-COVID environment, immediate lockdown one, obviously we're still dealing with a pandemic, but one of the things that they said that was brilliant during those times was the ability for government agencies to de-silo. And part of the foundation of what we're trying to achieve with the Impact Collective is the crushing down of organisational and territorial silos. The only way that we can be effective in doing that is to ensure that we don't silo back up. And what you're discussing there around breaking down those barriers, getting together across parties and working together, which will then enable the ministries to do the same and work in that collective all of government manner. I mean, the purpose behind the Public Services Act 2020 was to establish a framework that regional public service commissioners could go along and curate, call upon a regional leadership group of public service leaders, directors, to look towards what's happening in the community. The breakdown in that at the moment is we need to ensure that the community voice is there and how those community voices can be heard. So if we're starting to look at what well-being means for our community, I would hazard a guess that saying that our per head of GDP population analysis is probably not the right bearer of what well-being is. Some of the work that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is starting to look at is those different areas of what constitutes wellbeing. In your experience with the rest of the world, is there a robust conversation that's starting to occur around replacements of the likes of GDP for progressive economies and starting to go, hey, just the simple transactional nature that is GDP is probably not the right way in order for us to understand what's happening in our societies and in our communities.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think this is a tremendously exciting and important conversation that is happening in governments and fora all around the world. It's taken too long. I think for 50 years there's been a widespread understanding that measuring just GDP is an inadequate measure of progress. We know that oil spills and car crashes increase GDP, yet we haven't found an alternate for it. So I think there's some leading work happening in France at the moment where they're seriously investigating. Obviously Bhutan was a pioneer once upon a time with their gross national happiness. Some of the statements by former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern were really welcoming in that respect, that we were trying to look for a broader measure than just economic growth. But I think it's also fair to say that has still been the main metric that governments have strived for, that we're reporting to financial institutions. I'd love to see the day where maybe the carbon market or the carbon budgets are taken as seriously as the national budgets, that measures of child poverty are as important as our national Standard and Poor's credit as well. This is a conversation happening right around the world.
Awesome.
Something I think we need to acknowledge in New Zealand is that we've got the second most centralised government apparatus in the entire developed world. Only Ireland has a central government that collects more tax revenue and expenditure as a percentage of GDP than any other country. So that point you're saying around, how agile and responsive and actually devolving resources and decision making to local governments over COVID was a really effective, good model. I was working with the food rescue sector over the lockdown periods, and it was amazing to see the government literally giving those people at the front lines and communities who knew their needs best the resources to be able to meet it. So we've got a real challenge in New Zealand. We're such a centralised government system. Yet it's our communities that know what they need, know what they want to achieve, but frankly, they're starved of resources because all the putia goes up to central government. So I think that's another conversation we have to have as well. It's not just replacing the central national goal, it's actually giving local communities the ability to set and achieve their own local goals.
How do you go about that? I mean, that's a huge question to pose, but how do we go along and reliably devolve that functional decision-making process back down to our local level?
Yep.
I know that the Care in the Community program, which was alignment between Ministry of Social Development and Manatū Hauora, Ministry of Health at that stage, now Te Whatu Ora, was a really good example of challenging that transition of becoming locally led, regionally coordinated and nationally supported. And it did have a really big impact on addressing inequities in the healthcare system in particular, because it enabled frontline workers to be the local place, the local face for their local communities, and work with the whānau as needed. But we're not in a constant COVID environment. The government has reflected upon the fact that we need to start looking at reducing the overall expenditure towards COVID. But that then leads to the conversation of, if there was all of this good stuff that was happening when there was that free-flowing nature of funding, where to next if we truly mean and stand behind we need to be engaging and creating a sense of well-being for these communities?
Yeah, well, we're on a journey, and it's a slow one, and this is structural political reform. It never happens overnight. We've kind of had the regime as it is roughly since the late 1980s. You have to go all the way back to the 1870s for when we disestablished the provinces and really locked in the strong central state. So we're seeing an evolution though. We're seeing work actually happening best at local communities. So we're building examples and case studies of where it is more effective, it's more efficient, delivering better outcomes, which is building the case. We see those examples over COVID that you mentioned. We see advocacy coming from the likes of the local government review, looking at how we can do things differently. Other central government policies I think have helped, like whānau ora, devolving power and resources and decision making to whatu ora. So yeah, I think there's this big case study building, and unfortunately I'm not seeing that picked up at the political level yet. I'm not a member of any political party anymore, but I was recently at an economic development conference and one party came and said, look, we're willing to do deals with you local communities. The other party said, we've got a bunch of strategies and papers and we know what's best to let you do it. Asking a whole bunch of people from 60 odd different councils in the room, they all said, well look, we know our communities best, just let us get on and do it. And I think there's a opportunity which maybe is a bit nascent or not being picked up yet, but there's a strong sense in my travels around the country that this is a better way to do things, this is how people want to do things. But I also think it's a genuine principle of what a wellbeing economy would look like, which is genuine participation, giving people a say. And it's difficult when growing up in Tairāwhiti, Wellington felt like a million miles away, and the decisions that were happening in my community were done to us rather than something we were actively involved in. So I love the idea that decision making can happen locally, closer to affected parties, and people can actually get active and have a say.
one of the things that we heard right early on as well was exactly as you mentioned. They said, if you're going to do this, you have to do it with us. They had a choice term, which I won't say, but effectively it came down to stop riding in on your white horses and delivering services that we never asked for. The flip side to that were agencies were delivering these services and then expecting the communities to be thankful for them as well, which was their kicker entirely. But given your time within the Community Select Committee, what were the ways that you embellished and enabled community involvement right through to central government? Because we've been finding that community engagement is a terminology that's becoming the flavour of the month at the moment. Actually truly reflecting on what that means to transition it from being a staid noun written on a wall saying community engagement here to a verb and enabling this to occur are two fundamentally different conversations. And what we're trying to understand is what are some of the ways that, in your experience, central government were bringing the true essence of community engagement through? Or what are some of the things and steps that need to be put in place in order to enable that?
Yeah, well, I don't want to paint a picture that we're perfect or have the answer. In fact, I think we're far from it in New Zealand. Perhaps things have moved on since I left Parliament, but some of the differences or the positive changes that I was part of was pushing alongside Nikki Kay and Claire Curran from Labour and National parties for live streaming of select committees was one minor mechanism where people could actually participate without flying to Wellington. They could actually see what was happening in select committees where politicians work sort of more constructively around the table trying to fine-tune legislation rather than hit each other over the head with rhetorical sticks in the House. As a select committee chair, we started advertising more widely for consultation. But look, I think that's the bare minimum. And it was still very much that one-way model that we asked for information on X, Y, and Z and expected people to write an email or appear in front of us and tell us what they thought. And then it kind of went into a black hole where officials were able to contribute. Ultimately, the decision was always the minister's, what was happening with the legislation. So not a satisfying process, I think, for anyone. The government probably wasn't getting the right amount of information or was discounting, frankly, the information it didn't want to hear. The public didn't actually feel their say was particularly valued. I remember in opposition working on legislation around energy issues, and literally 99.9% of, I think, 4 or maybe 7,000 submitters said one thing because it was a political decision, absolutely discounted by the government with no real explanation or feedback mechanism for them. So we've got a long way to go. What I would love to see, I think we have to look offshore for some better examples. So we could start looking when it comes to referenda for having citizens' assemblies. So not politicians and officials crafting the shape of a policy, actually involving a representative sample of everyday citizens to shape those questions perhaps, or to shape the preferred options. Obviously that's informed by experts, but you take the politics out of it. And I think history and academic research very clearly shows there is a thing called the wisdom of crowds. We collectively make better decisions when more people are involved. So that's a good example, and we could trial it with referenda. I know Watercare's trialled that with some of the water infrastructure questions up in Tamaki Makaurau, which is positive, but it's very much a start. Something else I've heard that's happening with the sexual and family violence work within government at the moment is that instead of the officials summarising all the consultation they heard from the public and experts, they've actually gone back to the sector and asked them to summarise all the work, which is then presented to the minister and officials, which is a minor, but I think really positive development, because it's quite easy to, and this is natural, to have a spin or a take or a way that questions are framed. If you ask people to summarise what they said to you back or what they heard from others, you're only going to get better decision making.
Couldn't agree more. There's a couple of points that I want to pick up on here. I'm going to park one because what you've just articulated in terms of the summation of verbatim narratives is something that we as an organisation pay particular heed to, but there's an element there around artificial intelligence and the role that it can play in providing non-biased summations, as opposed to you bringing in your own personal biases into the way that you're theming and summarising. I'll park that for a moment. The other element to that you were mentioning, in some of the things that we've heard, there's two elements to it really. The first is the way that we approach community engagement traditionally has been in forms of surveys. And whilst reflectively that's nice, the census is a perfect example that it just doesn't hit the mark all of the time. It does in some areas, and it does for people who are affluent enough, have high enough literacy and numeracy in order to be able to do it, have access to a mailbox, who don't fear the repercussions despite the fact that we know that it's anonymised data and it's actually there to better paint a picture for Parliament and government and local councils to say, hey, this is where we probably need to be funding and sending more additional supports into. There is an absolute fear that if they're in an overcrowded house that there's going to be some form of repercussions. So I guess the question there is if we start looking at the true essence of what community engagement is, which is relying on the stories of those communities, getting out there, do we think that we're going far enough as local councils, as organisations, as central government in the way that we are choosing to engage? And if I reflect on a conversation that I had around Te Ao Māori perspective, is a survey going to cut that if we're truly remaining true to the essence of Te Tiriti? I would argue that no, it's not, that we need to be getting out there and engaging with them face to face and actually giving an opportunity to be listened to and heard. You mentioned before around the select committee having that opportunity to feed back, but again, that is on the basis of an economic assumption that they can get to you, or they can have access to a digital device, or they even know it's there. I mean, coming from a person who's semi-politically savvy, I wouldn't say I'm across the board on all issues, but it's interesting that the publications of when select committees are occurring is even vague to myself. So if it's vague to me who's interested in this topic, how vague is it to those that sit outside of it? One of the golden ideas that I've always had is around almost a state of the nation address that occurs on a weekly basis where it's gone along and televised free to air, but it's void of politicians. And all it does is it goes along and it presents the things that would come up under referendum. And so, for example, prior to the last election when we had the referendum around cannabis and legalisation there, how it would have been beneficial to have a completely non-partisan, just government, not government, but experts in the field being able to go along and have the discussion televised to the nation so that people can make an informed decision rather than working in theoreticals. I don't see New Zealand ever getting to that stage, but it would be helpful for the public if they had that ability to listen to experts, because if we look at the levels of trust, politicians are pretty near the bottom, somewhere down there.
Car salesmen, yeah.
Car salesmen and lawyers for some reason. But there's an ability to go along and have the experts have those conversations and lead them, and then be able to engage with the communities in the manner that's congruent with them. Be that face-to-face, be that through surveys, be that through any manner of abilities, just engaging on social media, so that you get the widest bunch that you can. But that's all based on trust and relationships, and we can't do that if we don't sit down across the table and actually afford the ability for people to have the time to have the conversation to build the trust.
Absolutely agree, and I'd also add agency in the sense that a lot of people know that, you know, even if they've got a majority perspective, if it's antithetical to the government's policy, it's probably not going to be listened to. So people want to know that if they're going to take the time to engage or write a submission or whatever it might be, it's really going to be listened to, and that hasn't always been the case. I love your idea. I think it's really neat, and you know, new technology means that the costs and the ability to actually do it are those barriers have been broken down, so there's no reason why not. The referenda was a good opportunity where we would have tested things. When you look at the referenda we've had since the 1980s, the wording of the question has been so critical for getting the actual outcome. And it's I don't want to say game, but You know, it's actively designed to force an outcome. So if we actually outsource that to people without a stake who were genuinely curious about it or representative of the community from the get-go, we'd probably get better questions. You also reminded me that we actually need to give people the resources to be able to participate. Yeah. I served on a provincial conservation board, and obviously our treaty relationship was important, and there was a history of consultation, but we would often hear from the local runaka that thank you again for consulting us at the end of the process. Yeah. However, we're working on a million things at the moment, and we might get back to you, we might not. We're, frankly, don't have the resources to be able to respond. And I think that happens across society. So if government or councils or entities are genuine about engaging, they're actually actively going to give the resources to allow people to do it. In New Zealand, we've got such a thin civil society sector that everyone's running on the smell of an oily rag and running a million miles an hour. Another consultation, even if it's an ideal, like really in-depth, multi-day consultation, people just don't have the time. So it's incumbent, I think, for resourcing. So a policy I'd love to see a political party adopt this election is a dedicated pot of funding, much like we did with the Community Journalism Fund, to allow entities, be it corporate, be it council, be it government, to actually run best practice consultation processes. Could be citizens' assembly, could be participatory budgeting, could be using new technologies. There's a whole host of areas that we could just do things better. If people are worried about the cost, the outcomes will be better. It's a better use of money, and this is one of the principles of a wellbeing economy, avoiding avoidable costs.
Yeah. Caleb can attest to the fact that he sat down with me and I spoke about myth number one, actually, around community consultation being that it's incredibly expensive. It might seem that way because community engagement, and I'll touch on consultation in a minute, but community engagement in its own right is phase one. It's building that trust and that relationship. Now, if you don't have that and you go immediately to a consultative model or a theoretical co-design and you don't have the trust, those additional two components are going to be exacerbated incredibly long, they're going to be costly, and it's purely as a result of the fact that actually you haven't spent the time that it takes to build the trust in the first instance. The other thing that we're finding is that the way that we were consulting, because the pathway for success for this is you start with community engagement. You get to really understand what are the issues that are going on in those communities or organisations before you move to a consultation, because you've got the trust, you actually know what the issues are, so you can build on that. You can consult around refinement, validation, for want of a better terminology, through that consultative model to then go into a co-design pattern to design the service or design the project, whatever the outcome is that's been sought. But if you skip the first processes, you end up with being done to again.
Yep.
And getting right to the end of the consultation before engaging with a group is a perfect example, because actually you've missed the entire thing, you've missed all of the community engagement to understand what their needs are. And you're right, there is, in terms of runanga or runaka, consultation fatigue, but it's not just them. It is the community in general, where there is a whole lot of talk and not a lot of doing. We've engaged with communities, the Rangitikei for example, we engaged with a group in Bulls, and their first thing was, well, we really are intrigued about what it is that you guys are doing and we really want to be involved, but are you just going to be another organisation that comes in and talks to us and nothing occurs? Or nothing is produced? Because we've told our story time and time and time and time again, and yet nothing changes. Yep. We need to be able to shift that balance. So it's interesting to hear that going through the process, that I think your idea around there being a pot of funding for this is going to save money in the future, because actually the communities will have build the trust and the relationship with those organisations that they then can go along and feed into and provide high quality community level intelligence to organisations that can then draw on that. What I've found historically is that a lot of the agencies, be it organisations, be it community groups, be it local government, be it Crown agencies, have this reluctance to fund that trust building stuff because it's this open door and they don't know. It's not the traditional, here's a project, get it started, here's the end point, job done, it's funded. It is this incredibly important portion, but everybody sees it as a bit of a vaporware, like, oh, that's a nice to have, as opposed to this is critical to the success of a program. How do we open that door? How do we get people and organisations to understand the actual incredible importance of going down the lines of doing this first, to build that trust, to build the relationships, to then be able to work through?
I think we need some brave leaders, to step up and show the benefits of it and act as a bit of a shining star that others can follow. And then it's going to take bravery culturally within inside ministries or other entities. It's going to take a bit of political maturity, that an opposition doesn't see it as an expense or an easy hit on the government, that there's a genuine sort of consensus that this is a better way of doing things, and it might take longer and it might cost more up front, but the benefits and the savings in the long term are substantial. We're so short term in this country, and I'd love it if we could take more of that long term approach. And I mean, there's so many examples where we've done things badly or shallowly and it's cost more or it's bitten us on the bum. You know, I've literally passed a law in an afternoon under urgency in New Zealand, which I find staggering, that we don't have those checks and balances sort of in our political system. Sir Geoffrey Palmer used to call us the fastest lawmaker in the West, which is true. And how many times has legislation had to be amended again and again and again to fix problems? But equally so, how do we make sure that real people get a say in engagement or consultations? Often it's only experts or civil society who have the resources or even are invited to participate. So something I'm quite excited about with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa is over winter I'm about to hit the road in an electric camper van and literally visit a bunch of towns and cities across New Zealand where we're convening representative samples of people to talk about the economy, what they think about it, their aspirations, and we can deliver those stories and aspirations to politicians at our conference. The line I'm working there is that the economy is too important to leave to just the economists. So what I'm trying to do is amplify everyday people's voices as well. And we've been doing that over the last year, sort of organising networking events, trying to get everyone from businesses, unions, faith communities, students, social support, everyday people together, because actually when it comes to the economy, and I should get it back to my day job, that this is something that impacts all of us, and these economic decisions are decisions that are made or design choices that were made. So often it's seen as something quite abstract or not for me, when actually the original term for economy is the Greek word oikos for house. It's a household. We've all got a stake in a perspective and an ability to shape what the economy actually is.
It's interesting because the reflection there is around the wellbeing aspect to it, and tying it back to that community involvement when you're starting to, because what you're talking about is a reshaping, all right? So it's this big problem that would potentially need to occur. So if we go back to those three elements of engagement, consultation and co-design, if you got to that co-design phase, one of the things that are critical for success is, one, the community has to buy into it. Because if the community doesn't feel like they've been on the journey and take ownership of it, that's when you end up with failures. But the element there is we are so good at filling the rooms with experts in their field. We completely miss those with lived experiences. And we completely miss having people that are provocateurs. Deliberately, they don't know, and they ask those genuine questions, which to experts sometimes get perceived as ignorant or stupid, but actually is genuine.
Or can get to the root of the actual issue.
Oh, that too.
Or say unsaid things, which people are avoiding.
So how do we ensure that we have that third mentality when we're doing this? And embedding that, so actually we don't end up with, I'm going to put a preface here. Being a representative of a community organisation does not mean that you speak on behalf of all of those, all of the members of that particular community. So we just need to have a little bit of nuances around that so that we actually put people who are reflective of organisations into the subject matter expert category. Because we've been really good at saying, oh, you're on the Consumer Council, so therefore you're representative of the community. So if you come onto our board or you come onto this particular project, you speak for everybody. We have a history of doing that for iwi Māori as well, as, oh, you're a member of such and such iwi, therefore you speak on behalf of. Yeah. Now, unless if they're appointed for that particular purpose, they are a mother, a father, a community member, a member of this organisation that just happens to be a member of that iwi. So we just need to take that positioning of ensuring that we have the subject matter experts there. Have to. There is some things that need that level of decision-making conversation there. But ensuring that we've got the people who are going to benefit the most or be impacted the most by these decisions are a third, and then a third of people that are there that are genuinely unknown, almost like how you form a jury actually. You just get everybody to come together and you go, right, we just need a bunch of 12.
Yep.
And that way we can increase the impartiality of what's happening and truly get to the crux of making sure that when we're designing with intent.
Well, I mean, you could make it a statutory requirement, but I think in an ideal world it would become a cultural change that people actually buy into it and see the benefits from it, and it's actively resourced. You know, I can imagine a situation in the future where agencies are competing to see who can do a better job. You know, there's someone responsible for maybe patting them on the back, you know, awarding them, but also accountability and monitoring, which, you know, is something I think we lack in New Zealand. We've got a lot of good accounting monitoring when it comes to, say, the Office of the Auditor and Controller General, you know, financial monitoring. But when it comes to best practice or community engagement, that's deprioritised. That's something, when you look at, say, the wellbeing budgets, the wellbeing report of New Zealand, that's something our OAG has pointed out and said, well, look, who's actually responsible for accountability and monitoring these new range of measures and dashboards and metrics? No one is the answer currently. And you raise the point too around the deep engagement and community support, why we're doing something. Again, to be mildly critical of the current wellbeing approach in New Zealand, and we've been collaborating with the Australian Centre for Policy Development because they're looking at wellbeing budgets and a wellbeing approach across the ditch as well, which we're calling Wellbeing 2.0. How do we actually, you know, take this great start but strengthen and deepen and embed it and make it so it's more impactful? And one of the big areas we're looking to Wales and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act you referred to is that just didn't come out of the blue. That wasn't dreamt up by a single politician. This was the result of 5 years of deep engagement where the community understood it, had participated, had followed this process. So they really had a genuine stake in making it achieve and be successful when it was passed. So reflecting on sort of our wellbeing approach in New Zealand, it was sort of happened and it was sort of announced in a press conference, but there wasn't that long history with it. And I wonder if that's why maybe some business communities haven't bought into it. So there's a lesson, but there's also an awesome opportunity for an open window for the next initiatives to really make sure that the public has deep buy-in for it.
Do we think that it needs to therefore be led by the business communities in terms of like the ESG reporting, all of the non-financial reportings around sustainability, around carbon emissions, climate action, that kind of stuff? Whilst there is some impetus in order to say, hey guys, you need to consider this, does it really need to be more structured than that so that the businesses take the lead? Or should it be that the communities are fronting this and saying, hey, we've had enough? Because to reflect on a comment that you made earlier, even if you've got 70 to 80% majority on a conversation, if the parliament of the time doesn't agree with that, it's not going to implement the change. So how do you lead that?
Well, I mean, business has to be around the table, you know. They are really the part of the foundation of our prosperity and our society and our economy. So they've got to be there. They are leading in many respects already, and you've given ESG as an example. One measure that I think is really driving good change is the carbon reporting. We've got the scope, I think, to build on that and actually broaden it so more entities are supported to be able to be aware of their carbon impact. But it shouldn't also just be the risk to the entity. It should also be the role and the risk of their activities. What's that playing with society? So yeah, some good work happening from business communities already, and some room to grow as well.
I think if we encapsulate it all, it's all of those different elements coming together for that collective purpose, which is again reflecting on the Future of Wellbeing, Future Generations Act, is something that if we had a similar thing embedded into our own political system, where the impetus was, if anything new comes before Parliament, it has to show directly how it's going to increase the wellbeing and not to the detriment of future generations, would be critical in that playing part of that success. And some of the things, I mean, if we're talking about false narratives around climate action, for example, I think that's been detrimental to the inaction of society as a whole in the past. But now, as we're seeing Cyclone Gabrielle's come through, flooding in Auckland, actually, not only is it now not able to be ignored, but it's having significant country economic impacts. What are the tie-ins here that we can start saying, hey, look, we can't ignore this kind of stuff anymore? And that, I know this is a bit of a circumnavigation around this, but that ties back to your earlier conversation around the biases and the approaches. And one of the topics that I just wanted to briefly touch on today is around the integration of AI technologies in terms of the false narratives and driving that. Historically, it's been somebody in front of a camera or someone with a microphone directing their version of a story. A perfect example, which was in media the other day, was Ryan Bridges and Taika Waititi's interview. Never occurred. And in fact, Ryan Bridges addressed it and he said, hey, like I like the guy, I've met him once, but I've never sat down and interviewed him. What do we think the impacts of this type of disruptive technology? We haven't seen this since the introduction of the internet in terms of absolute technology disruption. How do we think that this is going to start working in terms of advocacy, activism, but also leading the critical conversations into the future, such around controversial topics realistically?
Yeah, I mean, this is what you say, a genuine disruptive technology. It's shaking everything up. You know, even my kids are using it for school now. It's quite incredible that in a small space of time it's had such an impact. And it's impacting so many parts of society. And, you know, historically we've seen conflicts start over, you know, forged documents or faked documents. That's so easy to happen now. And, you know, could we see a situation where conflict's going to start over something that was faked? And it's so realistic and genuine looking that it is genuinely hard to tell. But I think, to bring it back to what we've been talking about mostly, surely the answer has to be to actually, if it is controversial, we're having these big national conversations, we've got to have it face to face. You know, we've got to have it sitting around the walls of a room. You know, we've got to be able to see people, and this is one of our wonderful advantages and treasures of being in Aotearoa, is that we are small enough that, you know, as a politician, people can come to my office, or, you know, people were playing rugby on the full court of Parliament. People had a genuine connection. We can, you know, meet our mayor, our councillors, or have a say. So that's going to be a challenge in bigger entities like the US. So surely that's got to be our superpower in cutting through some of the disinformation and fake news and getting to the bottom of it. We've got to make sure that people have the skills to be able to critically consider information and actually ask, well, why is that photo, that image, that interview being presented? Is it just a lark, or has someone got a motivation? So that critical thinking skills, which I think have been deprioritised in the sort of academic system, needs to be re-brought back out. But also I think there's a challenge there for individuals or organisations, you know, interested in using it, that you can lose credibility very fast by presenting fake information. I just saw on The Guardian today that Amnesty International got a bit of a smack on the wrist that they produced images for reports in Colombia which were entirely AI generated. They were fake. I mean, they literally got the Colombian flag colours the wrong way around. That's going to have a credibility issue for organisations that use these new technologies. So, gosh, it's an interesting time. But I genuinely believe you can go all the way back to ancient Greece or, you know, pre-European New Zealand. We make better decisions when we get around a table or a fora together. And it's sort of like a lodestar we can keep returning to.
It's definitely something that we've had to reflect on quite recently in terms of an AI's ability to do summaries. And we've been reflecting on the ability for biases to embed into decision-making processes. I think personally reflecting on the whole AI issue that we are facing at the moment is making sure that humans provide the human element. And I think what you've just reflected on there is critically important, is whilst the fact that we can go along and we can sit around the table and have the human interactions, we can then leverage against technologies through verbatim analysis by feeding it into AI generators to do some of that summation work for you before a human comes over the top and makes sure that it hasn't lost its true essence.
Yep.
Because effectively the advantage to that is, unless if you train an AI to have the biases, it doesn't have it. It's not innate, it's not human, which sounds counterintuitive and silly in its own right. But I think it does provide a critical ability to take out that partiality that can sometimes come across. But I just don't quite know how this is going to work for those controversial topics.
Yeah, and we've got to make sure that we're not seeing sort of those who design the AI, those perspectival biases are baked in. You know, it's a different analogy, but in the early days of photography, because it was developed by Europeans, it was pretty terrible, the print for darker skin tones. You know, is the way AI is being designed by primarily European or US-based entities going to have a similar biases? Being aware of that, and that's whatever, you know, facet of society, that sort of tyranny of the majority, as I think de Tocqueville said. But I think on the other side, we just shouldn't be afraid of regulation and sort of, woe is me, we can't do anything about it, we're just going to have to grapple with the consequences. I've been involved in internet and sort of technology regulation for, since the early 2010s, and I used to be quite an internet libertarian. I was, you know, the government should keep its hands off, you know, the internet can govern itself. And since then, we've seen, you know, the growth of social media giants. We've seen, you know, state actors provide disinformation. I think the tenor of public debate's probably worse. We're getting worse decision making. You know, we're seeing a corporate profit-driven approach harming society and the ability to have social cohesion. We need to, I think, have a conversation around regulating the tech giants. And equally so with new technologies like AI, we shouldn't be scared to regulate it. There's wonderful advantages. And, you know, you've given some examples. I love all the boring work, which hopefully a human wouldn't have to do, and, you know, can assist humans to do the more value-added or satisfying work. Yeah, let's use the benefits, but let's not be scared to stop and regulate the negatives.
Absolutely. Interesting topic. Flavour of the month at the moment, and I think it'll probably be the flavour of the 2023 year, to be fair, as we see it exponentially grow.
Well, this will probably be our first AI election. You know, comments on social media or bots on Twitter, or, you know, what controversy will happen with a politician that they weren't involved in at all. It's going to be interesting.
It sure will be. I mean, and that's coming back to clarifying and making sure that that human element's there, really, isn't it, for verification. It's been awesome today to be able to sit down and have the conversation around transitioning and gaining further traction on wellbeing in general. I think that there's been this assimilation between wellbeing and health, and what you've been able to articulate today is actually that's not the case. That it is the whole person and people on planet before profit, realistically, is what it's come down to. It's been awesome to kind of get a more central agency, government understanding of what are the complexities that you've had to grapple with when you're in there, and how can we transition that a little bit towards the future, for future success in terms of community engagement, in order to engage with them early, build that trust, build those relationships, make sure that we're not doing engagement fatigue. As Dame Turiana said, you know, what's stopping us from having one car up the driveway as opposed to 15 that when we're supporting people. We've been able to briefly cover off the hot topic today of AI, and I think this is going to be a bit of a feature for future podcasts, actually, and understanding what different viewpoints are. Especially, we've got a future podcast with Justin Lester from Loves Data, and his understanding of what the future for AI, for data analysis and generation is going to be quite intriguing. But the final question that I'll leave you with today is more of a personal get to know you in terms of big hitters in personal growth, business development. One of the people that I look up to is an American called Tim Ferriss, and he has a book called The Tribe of Mentors. And one of the questions that he asks, which we slightly tweak, is if you could go along and have a message on a billboard anywhere in the world that has this big puncher you want billions of people to know about, what is that phrase or that message that you want to get out to the world?
Wow, what a good question. I guess for me it's something along the lines of the economy is the product of design and can be redesigned. And what I mean by that is that we often think of the economy as like some sort of force of nature, this immutable force that we've got to follow its whims and its will, when actually it's a bunch of political choices. And I'm early 40s, and I reflect I've spent my entire life growing up in the shadow of decisions made in the 80s and early 90s, and they're baked in, and what we see in our society is a result of that, and it can change again. When I look at sort of history, which is sort of my big passion, we've had these big change moments. 1890s, the Liberal government and first age-old pensions, universal suffrage, the first Labour government in the 1930s, the welfare state, the fourth Labour government in the 80s, disestablishing the welfare state, bringing in neoliberalism. We're kind of overdue for the next big tipping point, the big next transformational change. So I would love people to feel agency, that they have a say with the economy, that we can redesign the system so it gets the outcomes that we want, well-being for people, a healthy environment, the ability to feel connected in our communities. These are all achievable. We just need to redesign the system to make sure it delivers those outcomes, because at the moment it's delivering perverse outcomes or delivering costs, or, I reflect on how much of the budget, we've got a budget coming up soon, is focused on failure demand. It's addressing avoidable and predictable problems because we refuse to invest up front. We've got a great opportunity, and it's really exciting with new technologies, new ways of thinking, these global partnerships, amazing work locally. This is happening all around us, and I see signs of the wellbeing economy in my travels around Aotearoa. This isn't academic or vague or fuzzy. This is happening right now, but we've got a long way to go, but we're on that track.
That's awesome, and something I think that's truly achievable for our communities is getting back involved. I think there's a little bit of education that needs to be required around civics again, if I'm being honest, and around the importance of participation, because I think historically we've gone down the path of what does my vote or my voice kind of make a difference in these, but what you're saying is actually it's fundamental. We can change the pathway that we're going down. We just need to go along and make sure that it happens. Absolutely.
I mean, it's changed before and it will change again. The question is, how will it change? And if we all, this is what you talk about Tim Ferriss as an author. The Better Angel of Our Natures is a book that really was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. The sense that we're good people ultimately, right? And things are, across the arc of history, getting better. And if you return to those human values, and you can see it expressed in Te Ao Māori concepts, the sense of community well-being, of thinking for the long term, of thinking of future generations, thinking collectively, these are like intrinsically human values. Unfortunately, I think the way we've designed the economy often prioritises anti-human values, competing against one another, individualism, thinking about the next quarter than a future generation. So that's what gives me a lot of confidence, that these human values, if we allow them to be expressed, are going to see outcomes we want to see.
Absolutely. Very cool. Well, kia ora, Gareth. Thanks for having us sit down and chat today. Really valued it, and hopefully our listeners did too. So tune in next week where we sit down and have a chat with Justin Lester, Government Director of Loves Data. Kia ora.